Hello, everybody. Welcome to my April wrap up. I'm going to start with a book that many consider their favorite fantasy book of all time, A Storm of Swords, Book 3 in A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. Martin. And so this was a reread for me. I read it via ebook with the illustrated edition. I have to say that the illustrations in the ebooks, or in the illustrated editions, I guess, are not quite as amazing as they are for book 1, I think, in books 2 and 3. But it doesn't matter because, the book is so incredible. After I finished the book, I tried to write out all the climactic moments that I could remember, and I came up with about 15, which I gave off in the live show at the beginning, and then realized I forgot about Danny's chapters. So there are so many crazy things that happen in this book, so many things. And that's not even to mention all the quieter moments that add so much richness and nuance to the story. Now, on this particular reread, I found myself very drawn to Jamie Lannister's character, especially, and I feel like because of that, I just had to do a video. It was kind of like a passion project video. And so I did a deep dive of Jamie Lannister. And with this, I call it a deep dive, but really, part of me feels like a little bit of an imposter saying that because you could really take anything I mentioned in that video and spin off a whole video just on one little thing. There's just so much there. But what an incredible experience. I love the way A Storm of Swords brings together so many threads introduced in books 1 and 2, and it does feel like the culmination of so many things. So, loved that book, loved the discussion we had over on Alex's channel. And from there, I'm going to go ahead and go into some Westerns. So, a little departure from fantasy, and then I'll come back to fantasy. And so, the first one I'm going to talk about is Butcher's Crossing by John Williams. So, if you don't know, I loved Stoner by this author, which I read last year and named my number one book of 2022. And Alan from the Library of Alexandria, who buddy read this with me in April, he labeled Augustus by the same author his favorite book of 2022. I loved that book as well. So I think for both of us, we agree that this one isn't quite as strong as Augustus or Stoner, and we both listened to this via audio. I did pick up the physical book towards the end. As you can see, there's a few tabs in there. But what I really enjoyed about this book was, once again, John Williams's prose is amazing. But I also really enjoyed this story about a young man named Will Andrews who goes on this journey. He leaves Harvard University to go on this kind of self quest to go to Kansas. And from there, he ends up in Butcher's Crossing. And this is around the year, it takes place in the 1870s. And there at Butcher's Crossing, he comes into contact with a man who is an expert buffalo hunter. So he hires this buffalo hunter along with a professional buffalo skinner and a man with a wagon. And the four of them go out on this big buffalo hunting expedition. And it turns into a big survival quest. I learned through reading this book that I never want to experience what it's like to be snowblind. But my goodness, it was quite the journey. The back of the book kind of spoils what happens, but I feel like there's so much to explore as far as how this fits into the Western genre. And I didn't really take that into account so deeply when I read this because I've never read a Western before. I've only read Cormac McCarthy. So I don't feel like I'm very well read when it comes to Westerns, but I thought it was really interesting because I enjoyed, for one thing, this character, Will Andrews, and how he seems to be really interested in finding a sense of self outside of institutions, outside of church, outside of Harvard, and he's expecting this big romanticized journey. But what he ends up finding is something very different than what he expects. And in the end, it's so interesting because he's on the journey, like I said, with three other men. I feel like all four characters we follow in this story, they all have very distinct characteristics, which all become amplified on this survival quest. And so you see what this does to people. I don't know. It was just an interesting exploration on that. It does open up with an Emerson quote. And it was interesting too, because after reading that book, actually just today, I picked up this book, which is The Man Who Wrote the Perfect Novel, John Williams Stoner, and the Writing Life by Charles J. Shields. This was gifted to me from Evie from She Was Only Evie. And so I just read the Butcher's Crossing sections, and it was really interesting to read how much research actually went into this book. For example, it says here that even though the book is set in the 1870s, it says here that in the 1850s, an estimated 20 million buffalo lived on the Western Plains, the most numerous single species of large wild mammals on Earth. And then it goes on later to say that in the year 1889, only 541 buffalo could still be found alive in the United States. So, pretty interesting. And also, it was interesting just to learn a little bit about what he was trying to do because a lot of Westerns at that time, I think that they were romanticized through a lot of the film at the time, romanticizing these journeys out west and what that signified for people. And so he's trying to bring a different take on that and go towards a very naturalist approach. Obviously, a self exploration, as I already mentioned, but it was also interesting to learn that this book was not well received. So it says here that in a review by Nelson C. Nye, this man calls it practically plotless. And he says the story contains little excitement and moves as though hauled by a snail through a pond of molasses. You can leave at any time. A lot of people will. Ouch. And it says here that Williams was horrified to receive that feedback. So, which is a shame. I really think, even though I'm not very well read when it comes to Westerns, I really appreciated just learning a little bit more context about the story. And I really enjoyed the reading experience. I think that the way that John Williams zooms in on the daily survival details of this journey and the landscape and the characterization and how these different characters are, how their characteristics are contrasted by the landscape or merge with the landscape. There were some interesting things there to unpack. And even what it meant to come back to Butcher's Crossing. There was a lot there that happened at the end, too. So I enjoyed this particular book quite a bit. And I'm just really sad that we don't have more books by John Williams. Now, in that nonfiction book that I just mentioned, it did say that John Williams did foresee some revisionist Western books coming up on the horizon, including the Border Trilogy by Cormac McCarthy. And so this is book 2, The Crossing, in that trilogy. And I finished this alongside Jimmy. We read this over 2 months, taking it about 10 pages a day, because there's always a lot to unpack in McCarthy's prose. So this particular book, it sounds like it's simple enough. We follow a young man named Billy in the 1930s, a 16-year-old boy, and he has this lone wolf that he catches. And he's on this mission to free the wolf in Mexico and cross the border and just come back, and as though, it's not a big deal. Turns out it's a bigger deal than he realizes to cross the border. And a lot of interesting things happen on this journey. It really takes a turn many times in ways I did not predict. But there are several intersections along this journey with interesting characters, interesting people who have interesting things to say about consciousness and about the one man that is every man and about the one path that is every path. There's a lot there to dig deep into, and I really want to go back and dig deeper into what McCarthy was trying to say and the connections between themes in this particular story. But my goodness, I'm still just so amazed with the ways that he captures the deep, rich nuance of Mexican culture at this time. And it was especially meaningful to me. And I don't know if I annoyed Jimmy because I was just constantly messaging him about how excited I was. There were particular parts of this book that referenced several locations I was familiar with from New Mexico, but even in Mexico, there is one stop along the way that happens to be a town where my grandfather was mayor. And it's a tiny, tiny, tiny town. I cannot even imagine how tiny it was during this setting in the 1930s, because I think it just reached like 7,000, a population of 7,000 a few years ago. Anyway, it was so surreal to read some of these things. And again, just little things about daily life and the people and the Spanish. There were several sections in here in Spanish that I translated. I was so proud of myself that I understood as much Spanish as I did. I always think I'm the worst with languages, but I don't know, this kind of gave me some interest in exploring whether I could learn more Spanish. And I thought that the Spanish sections, honestly, some of them were my favorite passages because they just had so much to those passages. Again, I mean, McCarthy just has this way of writing in this interesting, primordial, otherworldly way that just feels eternal, and it feels, I don't know, it feels like something just opens up in the human soul or in the godhead of all mankind. I don't know. It just always feels like bigger than itself. I don't know. It's interesting because, like, I was just talking about Butcher's Crossing and how, even though this is about this buffalo expedition on one level. It's about a deeper inner journey and connection with nature, or it's supposed to be anyway. But it kind of takes a turn that you don't expect, I guess, or maybe for the character that he doesn't expect. And this particular book, it's sort of similar in a way. I mean, it's really there are external things that happen, but there are so many deeper themes, deeper things to say about the human condition. And again, I just feel like I need to go back and just dig deeper into this story. But I just thoroughly enjoyed it. It was so meaningful for me. And I'm so glad that we got to finish this. All right, next book I'm going to go ahead and talk about is The Severing Sun by Von Roycroft. And so this was very kindly gifted to me from the author with a very kind note. Von Roycroft is just one of the nicest people you will ever come across. And he seems so incredibly knowledgeable. And I feel like that shows in the story. It shows in his world building, his attention to detail. And I know that this is very much described as a historical fantasy because it does draw a lot of inspiration from Germanic tribes. I think particularly the Goths, from what I understand. So I think like there's an epigraph that hints at some things that are going to come in this trilogy later on that really do have some significance in real historical events. In any case, though, this book is very much a prophecy driven sort of narrative. We follow these different neighboring clans who are at odds with one another. And there's a lot there about oaths and honor and destiny and about dreams and following that one's head versus one's heart, how to find your moral compass in a world where there are supposed gods, but no clear evidence of that at the same time. So it's very, very low magic in that sense. Though something did happen at the end that made me think there is a hint of some creepy magic to come. But the particular story is very much a coming of age story. We follow two main characters, a male and female character, teenage characters, and the prophecy is about this bringer of Uranon. And so this prophecy is all about this calamitous end of an era and the springing of a new era. And usually, when it comes to prophecies in fantasy, I find that usually prophecies are introduced at the beginning and tend to be quite cryptic. And then they're kind of like forgotten as you go along. And then they come back and you realize the prophecy, but it's not in a way you would expect. The prophecy in this particular book is at the forefront the entire time. So, because of that, I never quite trusted the prophecy to be as straightforward as it appeared to the characters. Other things to say, though, is that it's very action heavy, perhaps a little more action heavy than is my particular taste. It did remind me a little bit of John Gwynne in that sense because it does focus quite a bit on character work, but also weaponry. And there's an incredible duel, by the way, in this particular story. And I think that the topic of banishment, I loved the way that was described. There are several incredible epigraphs in this story, too, which add layers of history. And there's also a full glossary and cast list. Now, that said, it is very much coming of age, as I said. And what didn't work for me, because unfortunately this book didn't totally land with me, and the biggest thing were the sex scenes. The sex scenes did not work for me. Now, I am very pro-sex when it comes to books, and occasionally I do read sex scenes that make me cringe, and I usually just forget about them and focus on other things I like. Unfortunately, the sex scenes in this book, they weren't easy for me to forget. They did pull me out of the story because they did zoom in on details that I did not care for at all personally. They were very blunt, very non romanticized. I think I've learned that I tend to enjoy more romanticized sex scenes, except for Abercrombie. I love his sex scenes, and those are definitely not romanticized. I don't know, Abercrombie can get away with that, I guess, but that didn't work for me in this story, specifically because these sex scenes directly affected the character dynamics and therefore affected what happened in the story. And I didn't really like the way it affected that personally. So I kind of struggled with that. And that said, there were still a lot of things to appreciate, though. There was a same sex relationship that was explored in this story, and a really toxic codependent relationship and power imbalance that I thought was interesting in the way it was handled. But again, I just like, there were just some things that really pulled me out that didn't work for me. And there was also some characterization stuff with one character that I had a hard time getting behind because there were aspects of this character that were introduced in an epigraph right before that chapter later in the story, and it felt kind of hard to believe that that was authentic to that character. I think if it had been planted earlier in the story, that this character had this skill, then it would have been a little bit more believable for me. So I just kind of had a hard time with this story on some levels. And then on other levels, I really think it was well done. I think that the prose was very clean and clear. A lot was explored here that I think will appeal to a lot of fantasy readers. Lastly, I read the Arrows trilogy in the month of April. I binged this. It was like candy for me. The way I would describe this is it's very light fantasy, but also very nuanced. And I feel like it kind of crosses between YA and adult. It starts off more YA, more coming of age. There is some angst, there is sex, and then there are some very heavy things that happen in the third book. But I really enjoyed the way all those things were handled. Usually, when I read YA, and this is why YA is a topic I feel like I could do a whole separate video on. I have so many thoughts on that. But usually, when I've read YA in the past, I've usually read book one and felt like that was enough for me. I don't feel like I need a book two. And usually, if I read book two in a YA series, it never goes well for me, almost never. Usually, I feel like there's not enough complexity introduced in the world in the first book to draw my interest in having an expansion. In this case, I felt like there was a lot in the world that felt worthy of expansion. And in fact, even though this is a trilogy, a standalone trilogy in a way, there are several other books in this world of Valdemar. So I think Mercedes Lackey is still writing books in this world. I think that another one is coming out this summer, if I'm not mistaken. But this basically follows, this is like a foundational trilogy in this world, and we follow a young protagonist named Talia. She's very, very young at the beginning in the first book, but through her, we learn a lot because she is in this low-born society, a society where men have multiple wives, and she's about to be married off because she's 13, I believe. And that's when a horse comes and finds her and chooses her to become a herald for the queen. Now, the heralds for the queen, they're not like the typical heralds that you're used to in fantasy or medieval societies. These heralds are the arrows for the queen, basically. They are people who are messengers for the queen. They execute orders, they are adjudicators, they do all types of tasks, and they have all types of magical powers. Their powers are brought into balance not only through the queen, but also through those companions hand selecting them or horse selecting them. The companions are all horses. So if you liked Winter Night Trilogy with the horse companions, something tells me you might really enjoy this trilogy because I also think Winter Night is another one of those where it's blurring the line between YA and adult. This particular world, I felt like the magic was a little more grounded than Winter Night. I feel like Winter Night was a lot more whimsical, but this particular storyline, I think what I appreciated the most about the way that Lackey approached things is that this was written in the 80s, by the way. It has same sex representation and it never feels like it's in your face at all. Feminist themes, same thing, but it doesn't feel heavy handed with those things. And it has very nuanced, emotionally intelligent explorations on themes, including trust. So I feel like the first book explores trust in a very interesting way. And I feel like you get the understanding of like how important it is to establish trust, to be open to trusting others, to being open to being vulnerable, and how it's okay to need other people. So I feel like that's explored quite a bit in book one. And then book two explores the fragility of trust, how easy it is for trust to slip underneath us or to be taken away when we're not careful, when we, miscommunication trope is used a little bit. But I feel like all of these themes are also they're also brought into the magic as well. This does deal with empathy magic. If you liked Farseer Trilogy or The Way of Udan by Philip Chase, which explores empathy as well, I tend to like empathy magic is what I've learned this last year. But in any case, I think that it really handled some of those things so well and drawing boundaries in a healthy way. I talked about this with my husband, who's a counselor, and I talked about the different ways she was approaching emotions. And he said, it sounds like a counselor wrote that. It sounds like she knows psychology. And I still, again, am so impressed that this was written in the 80s. I just feel like, even though it's very light on the one hand, it's very readable, it's very nuanced, like I said, in the way it handles those things. So please let me know if you want a full review of this. I might be able to dig on some other things to talk about in a non spoiler way. But in any case, I just enjoyed this so much, and I look forward to reading more from Mercedes Lackey in the future. While it's not a book, I did finally read From Elfland to Poughkeepsie by Ursula K. Le Guin in the month of April. This was at Philip Chase's recommendation, and I finally got to it. It took me a while to find a copy of it. I finally found a copy on Scribd. So I read that and really enjoyed it. I have to say that if you read that particular essay, you're probably going to be like me and wonder what she thought of Sanderson's books or style or approach to the window glass approach to writing fantasy. And I tried to research what she thought of Sanderson. I couldn't find anything. But I basically got the inspiration to finally read this when I was on Why Read with Grace and Ben, and we talked about it. And I knew enough about the essay from Philip's channel, and I thought, this is ridiculous. I just need to read it already. Same thing with the Stephen Donaldson essay, which I plan to read this month. Just hold me to it. I want to read that essay too about fantasy and reintegration because he's often mentioning it. Now, I have to say, he was just dead on about this particular Ursula K. Le Guin essay. I cannot recommend it more, especially if you're somebody who thinks that fantasy prose doesn't matter, or you think that prose gets in the way of the story, or it adds to the story. Wherever you fall on the spectrum of what you think about fantasy prose, I highly recommend reading this essay. And I think that Philip did a fantastic job discussing it on his channel as well. That was my April, and I would love to hear from you what you read in April, any of your thoughts on any of the books I read, if you've read them, or if you're planning to read them. I would love to hear from you in the comment section below. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.